set the dimensions of the areas of risk management we're dealing with.
Where do we become okay as information security or cybersecurity professionals with we're doing the right amount of work to protect the interests of our shareholders, of our customers, of the community and country at large?
There is a portion of vulnerability risk that probably isn't even security risk. It's just technology risk. Your security team focused on that, because if they are, they're not going to respond that quickly to the 0 days.
We've got to filter out all of the noise and turn to the business and say, look, I know you don't know anything about cybersecurity risk. These are our options and these are the considerations and input. And I'm going to recommend to you, this is the way to go, but here are the pros, cons, here are the benefits and trade-offs for you, and let you make that decision from there.
What people miss is that risk is a language. The security team's job is to translate what isn't really meaning, what is a bunch of noise from sensors, into a language that folks that deal with risk every day can understand.
Your job is to actually get a number of people in the room that the C-suite or the CEO or the board say are sufficiently knowledgeable about the business, so can understand the questions you've asked from a business perspective and make informed responses.
The most productive and most exciting conversations I have are when we're talking about vulnerability management, talking about the risk of any one vulnerability or a group of assets, and somebody in the director of security, director of vulnerability management role says, okay, great. How do we make sure that nothing has a higher than 50% chance of exploitation?
This is a really good question that just came in from Steve. Does the massive cost increases in organizational impact with breaches and the ransomware, does that raise the bar on what is acceptable risk?
The fact that there's something in the media headlines which had a certain dollar figure, I don't think should really shift the thinking. The thing it might change is people's appreciation of frequency, of how often it might happen.
Those things have made people realize how unbalanced the distribution of losses is, and has maybe started a risk discussion, but I don't think it's changed the tolerance. I think if anything, it's changed what we measure and what the inputs are, or the urgency of measurement.
From Richard Yu, how can this be communicated to the C-suite as two different concepts from a cybersecurity point of view?
For me, risk acceptance is really a process where you're shining the spotlight on something. So one is more a data that drives a lot of decisions. The other one is a clear process around making the executive or leadership, whoever it is, aware of what they're taking on.
When you tolerate a risk, there's almost a time component in it. It's how long are you willing to tolerate that risk for? Risk acceptance is very different because it might be a bad thing. I think the difference is you want to keep measuring the risk you've accepted and watch it grow over time, because you have a tolerance for your risk acceptance, not just for the things that you tolerate.
Sean Kelly asked, do we have to define risk tolerances for theoretical risks up front, or is it better to have sound risk identification process and forums to discuss and manage them, remediate, or accept?
I think that the most mature organizations would be in a position to start looking ahead and start exploring those ideas. But I think for most organizations today, except for the most mature, I would keep my head focused on the very current things that we're dealing with and try to get consensus on that.
Set your organization's risk tolerance so high that virtually all risks are inherently acceptable. Then there is no need to spend resources on fancy controls. Why do you want to accept this incredibly bad idea?
I think if you start with an incredibly low risk tolerance or incredibly high risk tolerance, and you slowly start to walk it back, the theoretical implementation of that tells you about all those decisions you weren't actually conscious about, weren't intentional about, and you start making them intentionally.
Because then it allows us to have a conversation about the size of the losses we're willing to take on. That's going to drive conversations around our insurance policies, which the business absolutely gets on how to make decisions on insurance premiums.
Start accepting risk when you reach a threshold of 50.
It raises the conversation of what do we need about 50? And as soon as we can agree on a measurement, then the number doesn't really matter. We'll come up with the right one.
I've not yet seen that in my travels where people can get to the point of saying, we've invested to the point that we're now getting a diminishing rate of return at an aggregate level. I think really when you talk about rate of return, what we're really trying to use as an analog about when do we stop? And I don't think anybody's there yet, although there might be some bright stars.
I see Brian is here, and Richard Uhumwago. Explain why your bad idea is the worst.
You'll save so much money and time and not having to mitigate risks because your tolerance is so high. And just think of your SLAs. When you report to the board, you can just say, hey, all of our controls put our risks below acceptable.
Every risk register has a number, right? So once it hits 50, hey, we've reached the magic number. start to accept risk. If you're in a regulated environment, you can show the regulators that you actually have a process.
I really love the FAIR methodology, the FAIR taxonomy. Technology risk is more of a likelihood question than an impact question. But ultimately, technology risk can output a likelihood or a probability. Business outcome is very much an impact calculation. It's not always that black and white and they spill over, but if you can keep the two separate in your head and try to think of technology as a likelihood impact, it becomes much more explainable to business executives.
Every CISO has that job of contextualizing the outside events for their organization and giving the organization either comfort or concern. But what I don't think you should do is let it knee-jerk and drive your program, because if it's not in your program today, okay, well, then think about when the right time to include it is. Don't just sort of scurry along and make it the next priority for your organization.
I really like this discussion because I think it highlights the need for a plan, not necessarily the best laid plan. And it also highlights the need for a risk measurement. As long as you're measuring risk in some way, making a tolerance decision, making a baseline, and we don't want to exceed this, we don't want to spend beyond this, all of a sudden you're talking to the business almost by default. And any security team that talks to the business is more effective than one that doesn't.
I, for a long time, as in my security careers as a CISO, sort of had this anxiety around we've got to secure against everything. And, for me, I'm starting to understand the idea of acceptable risk was this moment where I began to internalize things really well. So start somewhere, start with a conversation, and your program will improve. Your relationship with your business will be so much better.